Hey, how's it going, everyone? In this video, we are going to be walking through another HTML and CSS tutorial. So the goal of the video is to walk through and learn how to build one of these little YouTube recommendation components. So I thought this would be kind of cool. Like, YouTube, obviously one of the most popular websites in the world, and it could be kind of fun to look at how you could build something like this. So this is one of the most common components on YouTube, right? It's in the recommended section, and this is how YouTube is basically like pushing all their videos. So this is how YouTube gets you to stay on there. This is what the algorithm is using in order to keep you watching videos. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to see how we could build something like this. And I'll walk you through step by step how, someone who's working in CSS and HTML might go about doing this and sort of the techniques that they would use. So I think this could be kind of fun. Now, I'm going to be doing all of this over here in CodePen. CodePen is just a really good environment to kind of quickly scaffold some stuff out. And it's also going to be really easy for you guys to follow along because then you can just see all the code on here as well. Okay, so we have our mission in mind, right? We want to build out one of these little recommended bars for this recommended section. Now, anytime that I'm going to go and build a component like this, it's always a good idea first to think about all the different parts of it and how they're laid out. And specifically when we're working in CSS, we need to think about that because that's what we're doing in CSS is we're explicitly sort of specifying like how these things are all organized and laid out. So when I look at this component, and we can just do this one here, the Red Hot Chili Peppers one, there's a couple of different things going on. First things first is I see two main sections. So I see this section on the left, which has the image and then like the video that's, playing when you hover over it. And then over here on the right, I see sort of like all this text and the information. So right off the bat there, we have two sections which are side by side next to each other. And actually you could almost say there's a third section over here, which is these sort of triple dots. But for the most part, there's two main sections. So if I'm going to build this in CSS and HTML, that's kind of the first thing that I want to account for. Let's just start from the sort of big picture, like we have two main sections, so let's code that in first. So over here in my HTML and CSS, I'm going to do that. Now, the first thing I'll do is create like a little wrapper div. So this wrapper div is just going to be like the whole thing. So this will sort of contain that entire recommended section. And let's go ahead and give this a class. So you can give this a class or an ID, it doesn't really matter, but we can call this, why don't we call this recommendation? So this is like the recommendation, the recommended video, and this will be the full container. So this will contain all the code inside of it. And then inside of here, we have two divs. So we have two sections, and I'll just put those in divs, that's fine. And the two sections, like I said, we have this section on the left, which is like the media. So that's like this image. And then over here on the right, we have all of the info. So we can go ahead and do that as well. And why don't we give these classes? So this will be and we can just say this is like the preview because that has like the image preview. And then over here, this can be the info because it has all of the info. So right away, obviously, like there's more to this component than just these three things, but right away now we have this general scaffold that we can work with. And it's always good with CSS, just start with the layout first. That's what I always say. So this is what we have over here. And we can, just so we can kind of see this, so we can see, okay, we have the preview and then we have the info, and I'm actually gonna up the font size just so it's easier to see. Let's do this. So I'm just making the font a little bit bigger just so it's easier to see on the video. We're just making it basically 1.5 times what it is initially. So we have our two sections laid out, but you'll notice that in the video recommendation over here, they're side by side next to each other. Now by default, because these are divs, these are block level elements, which means they're going to take up the entire width of their parent. And what we want to do is we want to align them so that they're next to each other. And anytime you're aligning things on a particular axis, whether it's like the x-axis horizontally or vertically, always a good idea to use flexbox. And so that's what we're going to do down here. So the first thing we'll do is add some flexbox display onto this wrapper div, this recommendation wrapper. So we can say recommendation, and then over here I'm just going to say display flex. And like I said before, if you're not super familiar with flexbox, it is just the best way to lay things out, either horizontally or vertically. And so now you can see just by giving this display flex, now both of these are lined up next to each other. So that's good. And really, this is like kind of a perfect first step because obviously we haven't added any of these elements in yet, but we have the basic layout and we have the basic structure of this component done already. And that's always the most important thing. At least I think the most important thing to do first. Cool. And so now what we want to do is we want to go in and we want to start building these out. And I think it's probably a good idea to start with this right section over here. So just like we did before, where we're kind of looking at the overall layout of it, let's do the same thing with this info section. So first we have this title, which is up here on the top, and it's kind of bolded and the text is a little bit bigger. And then down here we have like the user's name, and then we have down here this section that has views and years ago. One thing you'll notice about this section though is that there's two things here. So we have the views and then we also have the number of years. So there's almost like two sections. So let's go ahead and just lay that out as well. And we'll sort of get the, I guess just like the structure for that done. Okay, so this is all gonna take place in this info. So in the info, we're gonna have a div for the title. So I'm gonna give this a class. We'll call this title. And we can just copy the info from this video. So this is like a Red Hot Chili Peppers video. So Red Hot Chili Peppers, and it's like live or something. Okay, so we have our title. You know, none of this really matters, right? This would come from, this data could be arbitrary. But we have the title, okay? And then we also need the user's name down there. So let's do that as well. So create another div, and we're going to give this a class of username, and then let's just say the username is Mike for now. So we have that as the username, and then down here we have this section where we have the views and how long ago this video took place. So let's do that as well. Now, when we're creating this section, like I said, there's sort of two pieces of information that are in here, and there's I guess a couple different ways that we can do this. I'm not sure how they're doing it at YouTube. This could all just be one div, or we could have multiple divs that are side by side of each other. Now, the easiest way to do this would just be to have something like this. So if I just like straight up copied this text, and it's like not super easy to copy this text. Okay, so if I said down here, we could say like 6.5 million, and then, you know, 4 years ago. So we could do this like this, where both of these are next to each other. And that might be how they're doing it. But I want to show you another way that you could do this where there's two divs inside of here. So why don't we say, we can call this like view, or yeah, why don't we call this like view info. So this is going to be a div right here. And inside of here, let's have two divs. So one div is going to be for the views. So we could say like 6.5 million views. And then another section down here is going to be for like 4 years ago, okay? 4 years ago. And then even if we wanted, we could have a div here, which is like that little star. And so you'll see over here, we have like 6.5 million views, and then we have this little star, which is the separator, and then 4 years ago. And all of this is contained inside of this view info div. So this view info div has all of those in there. And once again, if we wanted to lay these all out next to each other, which sometimes can be a really good idea, we want to use Flexbox. And really, you know, like I said, we could do this in one line, but I just wanted to show you how we could use Flexbox for this. So we could say .view info down here in our CSS. And if I give this display flex, now all of a sudden these things are going to be next to each other. But check this out. There's some other attributes that we can use with flex as well to align these differently. So right now you can see that all of these are sort of next to each other. There's a property which is called justify content. And justify content is going to allow us to align these on that horizontal axis in different ways. So for example, right now it's at flex start, and flex start means that they're all the way over to the left. And whoops, this is just like reloading. We could also do flex end, and flex end is going to put all of these over on the right side. So you can see now all of these are over on the right side, aligned over there. We could also do center, and this is like my favorite one. So if you do center, then they're in the center. And we could also say space between. and this is going to put space between all of them. So you can see now this is kind of like nicely spaced out. You could also say space around, and that's going to put space all around these. So it's good, like anytime that you have components like this, like I said, I mean, we could just take all of this and, you know, you could just say like 6.5 million views and then whatever that little separator is, and then 4 years ago. So we could put all of this in just a line like that, and that's fine, but then we just have less control over it. And anytime you can have more control over exactly how these elements are laid out, that's good, because then the browser is not gonna like assume what you want it to do. So I really like this flex content. I think this is a good way of building this, and like I said, then we can sort of control what's going on with all of that. Okay, so for this one, I think space between is probably the best one for us. And for some reason, this isn't updating. Okay, there we go. Space between is nice because it just spaces them all out. Again, not sure what YouTube's using. Now we have this sort of right section done. And like I said, there's different ways that we could go about doing that, but that's generally what we want. And we can come back in and like change the fonts and everything and all that. But let's work on the left section now. So the left section has this little image and there's a preview, and then you can also see like there's some stuff in here. So there's like the indicator of like how much time the video is and all that. So let's go ahead and start formatting that out. Now, this is going to be an image. So right here, this little like, I guess, thumbnail, that's an actual image file. And then whenever you hover over it, YouTube's like loading in some video data. But if you want to get one of these videos, we can just inspect it. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to click inspect, and I'm just in Chrome, but this should work in like just about any browser. And I click over here all the way on the left, the top left of this window, this little like blue mouse clicky thing. And then if I hover over this, I should be able to see the URL of the image. So this right here, and I don't know if I can zoom in on this. This right here is the actual URL. So you see here in this source field, this is the URL of that image. So if I copy this and I pasted it into my browser, you'll see that this image actually shows up. So this is what YouTube is loading anytime you load this page. This is the image. So we actually have this image, so we can go ahead and use it. So back over here in CodePen, we want to go over to the preview section. I'm just going to space this out a bit. So instead of saying preview here, we want to put an image tag. So we could say image, and this is going to be self-closing, and image needs a source, which is going to be this long source. Images should also have alt tags if you want to be, you know, if you want to make this accessible. So we could put this as like thumbnail or something. This would probably end up being like the title of the video. Okay, but you can see here that now we have the thumbnail, which is right next to all of this content over here, and it's all kind of laid out in this particular way. Now on the actual YouTube site, the text here is a little bit smaller, so it sort of like fits in with the image. And even if we wanted to, like if you wanted to kind of sneak at what YouTube's doing, you can see here. So YouTube actually has this width property that's on their image tag, which is setting it at a specific width. That's another thing that we might want to do as well. So if I put the width out like that, and now it's the same width as this actual image, but anytime that you set this width on here, that means that it'll always be that width, because when the browser loads and displays an image, it'll always display the image at its resolution. So if the image is 1,000 pixels in width, it'll display it at 1,000 pixels in width. So when we put the width attribute here, that way we're just like specifying, okay, this is always going to be 168. And this is another thing that you could do in CSS as well, if you wanted to. Okay, so we have our image, which is loaded over here. And there's another aspect to this as well, which is this little time. So you can see here it says like 1 minute and 33 seconds, right? That's something else that we might want to add in. So let's come back over here, and we are going to do that. And I'll show you how we can align that. So one of the interesting things about this is that it is sort of like up top of the image a little bit. So it's like overlaid over the image. So we can take a look at how we might do that. So first off, let's create a div for it. And I'm going to give this a class. And why don't we call this timestamp? I guess that's a good name for it, or just time, whatever. And this is like 1 minute and 30, or what is this, like hour, 33 minutes and 48 seconds. So boom, that's the timestamp. Now, what we want to happen is we want this timestamp to go over on top of the image. And the reason that the text is so much bigger is just because I have this font size attribute here. So if I reduce the text size, you can see now it's like more reasonable. But basically we want this 1 minute and 33 seconds thing. We want that to be overlaid up here on top of the video. So how can we do that? Now, anytime that we want to take elements like that and overlay them over other elements, we have to do this using CSS positioning. So CSS positioning allows us to take an element and position it either relative to where it's supposed to be or in an absolute way to where it's supposed to be. So by default, all CSS elements have what's called static positioning, which means they're laid out in the way that you lay them out in the HTML. So here in the HTML, right, I have this image tag, and then directly after it, I have the div. And that's exactly how it's laid out over here. So we have this image, and then down here we have the timestamp. So that's called static positioning. It's the elements are lined up technically where they're supposed to be. We can change this, however, by changing the position. So there's two other main positions that we work with in CSS. There's absolute position, and then there's relative position. So relative position allows us to position an element relative to where it is in the document, and an absolute positioning allows us to position an element sort of relative to its, technically it's relative to its nearest positioned ancestor, but it's relative to basically like its parent that has a position. So I'm gonna walk you through how we would do that, but this is just kind of I guess a recap of positioning if you're not sure about it. So this container here, this preview container, is really important because this is what contains the image and what also contains the timestamp. And this element right here is what we want to assign a particular position to. So this element needs to have what's called relative positioning. And I'm going to go ahead and add that here, and then we can talk more about why it needs it. So I'm going to say .preview, and preview should have position relative. Next, we have this timestamp. And once again, I'll explain this in a second, but the timestamp also needs to be positioned. So in this case, we need to explicitly position two of these elements. So two of these elements shouldn't be static position. And let's go ahead and add some styling for the timestamp. So the timestamp down here, and we're going to give this a position of absolute. So this is going to have absolute positioning, and then its parent, which is this preview div, is going to have relative position. All right, now check this out. So if I was to just save this, you'll see that nothing changes, right? So this timestamp is still there. Everything looks the same as it did before. What we need to do, though, is we need to tell CSS where we want this timestamp to be absolutely. And we can do that using the right, the left, the top, and the bottom attributes. Now, if you look here, this is sort of at the bottom of this image, and it's sort of at like the bottom right of where that image is. And so that tells me that we should probably work with bottom. So I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to say bottom is 0 pixels. And let's see what this does. So if I give this a bottom of 0 pixels, you'll see that it places it here right at the bottom of this element. And next we can do is put it over on the right. So if I say right 0 pixels as well, now it's going to put it over on the right side. So you can see already this timestamp is kind of like showing up there at the bottom right. Now it's difficult to see. You'll notice here that this has sort of like a background and some white coloring, and we can add that in a second. But I do just want to finish talking a little bit about some of these positions. Now, check this out. So if I was to take this preview component and I was to change its position back to static, now remember, static is the default position. So I could even just like comment this out and it'll be the same thing. Now take a look. If we scroll in here, you'll see that you don't even see the timestamp anymore. So we don't even know where the timestamp is. Now technically the timestamp is showing up down here. So it's showing up all the way down on the bottom right of our HTML document. And that's because anytime we have a absolutely positioned element, it's going to position itself relative to its nearest positioned ancestor. So basically it's going to position itself relative to an element that's above it that is also given a non-static position. So preview, because this has a static position, even though timestamp is inside of preview, because preview is now static, it's not going to position itself relative to the preview. It's going to position itself relative to the actual HTML document. And so when we want to do this, if I want the timestamp to be at the bottom and the right of the preview, I have to give the preview a relative position. And then the timestamp's going to jump back and you can see that it's right there. Now we could also give preview an absolute position and it should do the same thing, but you'll see that that's now going to mess everything else up. So we want to keep this at relative. So honestly, like these positioning things, if you can understand these in CSS, they are just so powerful. It is one of the more confusing topics for beginners, but hopefully that gives you like a good idea of how that works and why we would do something like that. So the next thing that we want to do now is like style this a bit. So, you know, maybe it's like a little bit up off the bottom or a little bit to the right. So we could say this is like, maybe it's 5 pixels. And I'm okay using pixels here because we're giving this image like a static pixel width. So the image has a width of 168. And so because it has a width of 168, we can use pixels as opposed to something like REMs or EMs or some percentage, like some relative unit. Okay, so I like this. I think this is like positioned in kind of a good spot. So now what we want to do is give it that background and give it the white text. And that's going to be down here in the preview. So, or actually no, that should be down here in the timestamp. So the timestamp has the actual, you know, time in it. So we can go ahead and style this. So I'm going to give this a background and let's just give this a background of black. I think it's supposed to be a black background. And then we're also going to change the text color to white. So we can just have black background and white text color. I'm not 100% sure exactly what YouTube's using. So if you look at this here, now this is showing up a little bit better. I also want to give it some more padding. So you can see here, these are kind of padded out and it also has like a border radius. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can give this padding maybe like, I don't know, 0.25 rems, something like that. Okay, that might be a little much. Maybe we could do like 0.15 rems. Yeah, that looks good. And then let's give it a border radius of 0.25 rems. Okay, so now this thing, you can see it has this nice border radius. It also has all of the text inside of it, and it's definitely a lot easier to see. Now, YouTube might be using a different font. I think they are. It also looks like it's kind of bolded. We're probably not going to replicate this like exactly, but I just want to give you guys an idea of like how this could be laid out. So you can play around and like try to make it look exactly like the YouTube one, but otherwise, we're just going to kind of go through generally how it works. Now, you'll notice on this YouTube thing, when I hover over it, a video starts playing and then 2 other elements show up like this. So this is something that would most likely be controlled with JavaScript. So when we hover over the video, YouTube's going to like, you know, download the preview of that video. Yeah, I'm sure they have all that like stored somewhere. And then these things will also show up. So you could get these to show up exactly like the way that we did it over here using this absolute and relative positioning. But the whole idea of like the user hovers over it and then we completely change the view, that's something that we would want to do in JavaScript. That's not something that would be reasonable to do in HTML and CSS. So I'm not going to cover that here. But okay, maybe one extra thing we might want to do is make it so that this is like a cursor. So you notice my cursor turns into this little hand when I hover over the video. The way that we can do that is on the timestamp. Or actually, no, this would be on the preview. So on the preview, we could say cursor, and I'm just going to say pointer. And so now when I hover over this, check it out, we got this nice cursor, which is this pointer, and that means, you know, the user could click on it and do something like that. All right, so that's how we could do this left section over here. And like I said, there's some other stuff you could add in, but I think for now that's fine. And the right section over here now is where we're going to want to style all the text. Now you'll notice that I guess this is like the title of the video here is definitely bolded and it has this white text. So I'm on YouTube with a black background, but if you're on YouTube with a white background, it would change. So we're gonna style that text. Now we have a class for that. So if you look down here, now we're back in this info section. So the title is here and we can style the title. So I'm gonna put some styling down here. And the title then, let's give it a font weight of bold. So we're going to bold the text. So now it's like nice and bolded. We could also increase the font size. So we might want to increase the font size to like 1.25 REMs. So 1.25 REMs, that just means that it's going to be 1.25 times the rest of the text. So generally, like, browsers have text at about 16 pixels, and this is going to make it so that it's 1.25 times that. So there we go. We have our nice title. Now, also another thing we might want to look at is what if this spills over to the other line? So like this video title, you can see it spills over. So Red Hot Chili Peppers Live Reading Festival. So we could add that in, Red Hot Chili Peppers Live Reading Festival. So you can see here that in this case, even though we have all this extra text, it actually goes off to the side. This is just because we have given it that much room. So if I was to move this down, you can see here that the text now goes on to both lines. Now, one thing that YouTube is doing, which is really, really common when we're building websites, is they're truncating off this text. So you can see here, this title technically is longer, but YouTube's only putting it out in 2 lines. Now, this is definitely something that you're going to want to do in JavaScript. So being able to truncate this text right here would be like a JavaScript thing. You'd want to do that in JavaScript. So we're not going to talk about how we could do that. But if you look here, obviously, if we make this smaller, then it'll sort of do that. Now, one thing that we could do to sort of mitigate this problem is we could give it a maximum width. We could do this on the recommendation. So I could say width here, and we could give this a width of like, I don't know, 500 pixels. Let's just play around and see what that would look like. So maybe we could try 400 pixels. So if we give this 400 pixels, this actually looks pretty good. And so now the widest that it can be is 400 pixels. So now the text is kind of put like that. So you can add that width in, or you can take it out. It doesn't really matter. But that's just some thoughts about, you know, truncating that title and doing stuff like that. Okay, so we have our title over here. That's looking pretty good. And then we're gonna also wanna have the like username section. So if you look over here, it looks like this text is maybe like a little grayed out, but I don't know that we would even need to change it that much. So maybe we could just increase the font size a bit just to add some styles to it. So we have a class of username. So down here, we could say username, and maybe we could just increase the font size to like 1.1 REMs, something like that. Okay, so that's like a little bit bigger now. I also wonder, do they have the cursor? Yeah, so the cursor is actually a pointer on all of this. So if you see here, no matter where I go, my cursor is still that little pointer. And so we could actually add that over here. So we could say cursor, pointer, and now all of this stuff is gonna have that cursor pointer. And because we did that, we could get rid of that on the preview. Okay, so then finally, this is actually looking pretty good. The last thing would be this section down here. So I kind of used this section to talk about flex and talk about how we might style things like that. I don't know that YouTube's actually using flex there. We might not need to, but on the view info section, you can see down here, and where do I have that? Okay, so we're using justify content space between. That's spacing it out nicely across the entire element. But if we just put this back to flex start, then it'll look like it does kind of on YouTube. Okay, so the last thing then that we want to do is add some margin between these. So on YouTube, you'll notice that there is some space in between both of these things, and that's something that we could add in here. So what I would do most likely is come over here to this preview component. So this is, remember, on the left side, and the preview component, I'll just give it a margin right of maybe 0.25 rems. So that's like a nice little margin, and maybe we can go up to 0.5. Cool. Now, once again, with these rems, because these confuse a lot of people, it all has to do with the website's font size. So 0.5 rems, if the website's font size is 16 pixels by default, it's going to end up being 8 pixels. So this is just a relative unit. And the reason we like to use those is because then it scales if the user increases their font size. Okay, but otherwise, this is actually looking pretty good to me. Now, obviously, like, the font is a little different. I'm not sure which font YouTube is using. Maybe we can like take a quick peek here, see if we can find it. So I guess this could be kind of useful to learn. Like, if you are looking at a website, generally you can find out what font these things are using. So if I just like click on some of this text, And then over here on the right, and this is on Google Chrome, but it should be the same for just about any browser. If you go here to this filter and then you look up font family, you can see here that this font family attribute shows up. So I can actually see which font family YouTube is using. And obviously it's Roboto. This is like Google's font. But I'll show you real quick how we could add the Roboto font in. So if you go to fonts.google.com, and this is like the best website to get free fonts. Roboto is a font that's like Google's font. So it shows up right here, but you could also just search for it. So Roboto, let's click on it. Now I'll show you how to add this into our CSS. So there's a bunch of these different styles, and depending on the website you're using, you would want to select all the styles that you need. In our case, we're just going to do like a regular 400 font. And then why don't we also have a bold font as well? So the reason I want the regular font is because I have all this sort of regular text here. We also want the bold font though, because this title is bolded. So remember, we gave the title a font weight of bold, so we're gonna want that. Okay, so I click on, I selected both of those styles. These are the ones that we need. And then down here, it tells you how to import it. So there's this link tag right here. I'm gonna copy this. Now this should generally go in the head of your HTML. And the reason we want it to go in the head of the HTML is because when it's in the head of the HTML, it's gonna load before anything else in the page. So any script tags, any link tags, any CSS files that you put in the head of the document, all of those need to load before the actual HTML and whatever JavaScript in your page loads. And a lot of websites will get into like performance issues because they have a bunch of stuff loading in the head when really it doesn't need to be. So anyway, that's just like a quick aside about that. So we're gonna copy this link, and if you're working in CodePen, we can add this to the head by going to Settings, HTML, and then here it says Stuff for Head. You're just gonna paste that in. And then we can save and close. If you're not in CodePen, if you have an HTML document set up, it would just go in the head. So on CodePen, you don't need that because it's whatever, but in a regular HTML document, and if I can type this correctly, you just put it in those head tags, and then it would load. Okay, so now we have the Roboto font loaded, but the last thing we need to do is add that as the font family for the entire document. So over here, we could put this in the recommendation, which is like this wrapper. We could also put it here. So when we use this wildcard asterisk character, this is just styles for the entire document. And so here we could say font family, and Google Fonts has the code that we need right here. So we can copy that, and we'll put that in here. Now you'll notice that Google Fonts tells us to put Roboto and then a comma and then sans serif. This is another thing I think a lot of beginners sort of struggle with. Why do we need multiple fonts here? Well, this one right here, Roboto, this is the font that we want to use on the website. And because we're loading it in the head of our document, right, because I have this link tag here, that font is going to be loaded for me. But here's the problem is sometimes on a browser, you won't be able to download the font, or a font won't be supported, or something will happen where Roboto isn't able to load or isn't able to be displayed. And in that case, sans serif is going to be like a backup. And so sans serif is a family of fonts. It's like a very general category. And basically this is us telling the browser, hey, if Roboto doesn't work, I want you to choose whatever sans serif font that you have by default. And generally the browsers are going to have that. So it's just sort of like, you're telling the browser hey, I want this, but if not, I want this other one. And you can see here that just by doing that all of this is now looking a little bit better. So it's looking a lot more like the YouTube sort of recommendation thing here. Now, one thing that's bothering me is that we have this asterisk here instead of a little dot. I wonder if I can inspect this. This is one of the cool things about the web is I can inspect this here, and we can see what this is. Yeah, so I don't even know how to put this character in. Anyway, if you can figure out how to put that dot character in, then it'll look a little bit better. But otherwise, this is looking pretty good to me. So we've talked a little bit about how this is structured. Now, obviously, this might need a little bit more work if we wanted to get it perfect. If I wanted to get it to look exactly like it looks over here on YouTube. But for the most part, this is how I would go about designing something like this. It's probably similar to the way that they did this on YouTube. And really, there's just these core concepts that are related to this. So some of the core concepts that we talked about, Flexbox, right? So we've used Flexbox to lay this out. We used Flexbox to lay it out horizontally, so these things are next to each other. We also talked about how you might be able to use Flexbox to lay something like this out. Maybe you want to do that, maybe you don't. And then another concept that we talked a lot about was positioning. So being able to position this timestamp on the bottom right corner of the video, we had to give the container, so we had to give this, and where was this? This preview container relative position, and then we had to give the timestamp absolute position, and that's how we were able to do that. And remember that if the preview doesn't have this relative position, then the timestamp is going to end up being down here on the bottom right of the document. Okay. So I think that just about does it for this. If you want to keep playing around with this, making it a little bit better, making it your own, that's totally fine. But that just about does it for me. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.